Tonight's guest is a writer and journalist whose career has been a ceaseless battle against all forms of totalitarianism. A fierce proponent of Enlightenment values, he argues not only against religious extremism, but against the existence of religion itself. And as a polemicist, he's taken aim at everyone from Mother Teresa and Henry Kissinger to Bill Clinton and Michael Moore. In 2010, he was diagnosed with an incurable form of cancer. And I was invited to his house in Washington, D.C. to discuss whether the approach of his own death had caused his combative view of the world to soften, and whether he now wished to repair his long-running feud with his staunchly conservative brother, Peter. I talked with him about those and other matters in confidence. I was going to start off with some in-depth political question, but I suppose I really want to get the shit out of the way. How are you feeling?
How am I feeling? I'm on a slight sort of plateau at the moment. I'm the prisoner of chemotherapy, so everything depends on putting poison directly into my veins. So sometimes if I don't feel terrible, I think, damn, it's not working. I mean, you want it. You want to feel you're being poisoned because you want to feel that the enemy within is also feeling bad and feeling like giving up. So today I feel reasonably fit and secretly worried that I would be better off feeling much worse.
Is it directly related to mood? I mean, you actually feel physically ill and then your mood shifts with it, or...?
Well, you feel very tired, physically, a lot of the time, and then often very demoralizingly visited by nausea. Even when you haven't eaten anything for a long time, you think, why am I still puking? Sorry for the expression. And that's very upsetting and also very exhausting. But copable with. The worst days are the ones where you have what is informally known around the clinic as chemo brain, which is fog in the head. You don't feel up to doing much. I can read still when I've got that. But even writing a small thing is quite difficult. Those are the worst moments, because you're afraid of becoming boring to yourself and others. And in my case, because writing is, I would like to say grandly, not just what I do, but it's more like what I am. If I felt I couldn't write, it would undermine, I suppose, my will to live. Or at least it would make me wonder what the point was. So chemo brain is the worst.
Do you ever have the feeling, I've got to settle some scores?
Oh, sure.
You're racing to settle scores?
Not racing, because I'd like to think I was always in a
hurry.
I always had a sense of urgency about doing that. No, I'll give you a morbid view of it if you like. I mean, I hate the idea that somebody like Henry Kissinger, who is what, well into his 80s now, or Pope Benedict, likewise, would live long enough to read my obituary, when I had fully intended to be writing theirs. And I make no bones about it. That's why I don't ask for sympathy, because I'm not intending to dish it out either.
You've been such a successful and interesting and fascinating, provocative political analyst over the years.
Thank you.
I wonder what feeling you have about America today. I mean, coming here, there's a sort of sense almost that America's lost almost the will to live. It seems to be sad and lacking spirit. It seems almost as though it's rolling over and waiting to be overtaken by China and by India.
Yes. The great thing about the United States and the historically magnetic effect it's had on a lot of people like me is its generosity, to put it simply. Broad-mindedness, curiosity, willingness to accept strangers, allow them to become citizens really quite easily, assimilate to their arrival. There's a tremendously cramped feeling now, mean-spirited feeling, that was very much to be detected in the last election cycle. People talking in, what I would once have called, I suppose, sort of Dennis Thatcherite terms, curmudgeonly, but rather less amusing than him. Countries filling up with riffraff, country going to the dogs. President doesn't seem to be completely 60 nanas to the rupee, might even be a Kenyan. Petty, spiteful stuff of that kind, often from quite senior people. Hardly even deserves the name of cynicism or pessimism. It's just sour and nasty and boring. That's been a depressing reflection, yes. And I know it comes from the feeling, they're probably both related, that the country itself has very rapidly and suddenly and unexpectedly ceased to be the hyperpower. That at best it's one power among many. And second, and subliminally related to this, the feeling among, what shall we say, anything's too much of a generalization. Let's just say white Americans for now. The realization that they're not going to be the majority quite soon. They'll be the largest group, but they won't be the majority. Actually, it's already true in several states, and it's going to be true in several more. And no one quite knowing how to react to that. And all of these things are going to need very careful handling and require a lot of thought and reflection. And all I know for now is that there are several tones of voice in which not to talk about it, how not to address it. And one is by saying, the president is a secret Muslim, for example. Really unworthy stuff of that kind.
Because I remember you give it's a very moving and a very affecting and contagious account of why it was that you decided to move to America, and so many of the attributes of America which affected you, which led to your move, almost the ones I'm talking about now, as perhaps disappearing. Let's talk a little tiny bit about, I think we're back to 1981, aren't we? And Mrs. Thatcher and all the various little elements which led you to decide that America was where you wanted to be.
I didn't decide actually to emigrate to the United States till 1981. I remember buying a one-way ticket and leaving Heathrow that way and deciding that I'd become an immigrant simultaneously immigrant. But long before that, I'd felt the gravitational pull of the American planet and came in the late 60s, early 70s. And yes, it was quite nice to find oneself condemned to cliché. It really was a land of opportunity. People really would not just invite you on short acquaintance to come and meet their family or stay in their place in upstate or by the shore, but they'd mean it. If you went to a bar, you didn't have to buy matches, a particularly mean feature of pub life in Britain. You want matches? Yeah, it'd be 5p or something. No, we haven't got any ice. Here, you'd have to ask them not to put so much ice in. And they wouldn't pour drinks through some wretched little optic. The barman would do his pouring for you. Whole different attitude. And so much of it, and so much room, and so much humour. Yeah, everyone's said it in their different way. I said it in mine.
But these are, I mean, the ice in the drinks. I mean, of course, the skyline of Manhattan. I'm just quoting from your book. And the music as well. The music was important.
Certainly. In particular, for some reason, music about air travel. Get me a ticket for an airplane. I was very gashed to see the singer of that died in Nashville the other day. That meant a lot to me when I was a kid, as did, of course, leaving on a jet plane that everyone remembers, usually at the end of some not particularly well-judged relationship. But very important was the idea in America you could just go to the airport, get on a plane. I mean, in England, the idea of making a plane journey in those days was an undertaking, a privilege, and so forth. People flew. Freedom to fly. By the way, another great thing that's become cramped, boring, miserable, humiliating now because of the Homeland Security farce and bureaucracy. Flying isn't a pleasure anymore. You don't feel free to fly at all.
That all those cultural elements, you also, I mean, they're lined up against almost an ideological background which saw America as an aggressor, as an example of almost the worst excesses of capitalism.
Yes.
I mean, there must have been an ideological shift which enabled you to come to America, apart from all those cultural particulars which you cite.
Well, no, the ideological irony, as I would rather say, it didn't involve a shift. It was more, to phrase it like this, which I think I do in the book, which was that the first president I remember was President Kennedy, and I hadn't been as impressed with him as most people were, and couldn't forgive him for thinking that it was worth killing everyone in the world for a squabble over Cuba. Still don't. Once was briefly famous for saying that, like everyone else in my generation, I could remember exactly where I was standing and what I was thinking on the day that President Kennedy nearly killed me, which was the missiles of October '62. Still don't take part in the kitsch generational sense of tragedy about his departure. I think the Kennedy family generally overrated. But anyway, that gives way to me, in memory still, extraordinarily brutish looking and sounding face and voice of Lyndon Johnson and his imposing, tyrannical manner, in particular as that involved him trying to bully the Vietnamese by means of chemical weapons. Bullying is understating it. Chemical weaponry and heavy machinery into bending to his will. All of this, and the long denial to a huge proportion of the American population of the right to be considered human, really, and a terrible convulsion in the political sphere involving other assassinations, other dramas, that all this could be happening when I got here, at the same time as a major unjust war overseas, major domestic revolution within the borders. What was going on? Huge discussion on whether women should have the same civil rights or should be considered in part of the same civil rights movement. Early suggestions that people of different sexual orientations might have rights too. Amazing discussions everywhere you went about every sort of psychosexual, socioeconomic, ethnic form of, people would say then, liberation was the key word then. Emancipation would be fine by me. Extraordinary that the country could manage to do all this at the same time.
It was.
And publish it all, and put it all in amazing movies like Easy Rider, or Bonnie and Clyde, and in imperishable rock moments and the songs of Bob Dylan. I thought, no, I could live here. I mean, my God, this is very serious.
And also you had literary exemplars, didn't you? I mean,
yes.
You record thinking about, well, Wilde, Auden, others who'd come here.
And in the view which a lot of my sort of literary type friends would have taken when I was at Oxford in the late 60s, that America is sort of vulgar, crass, commercial, and so on, which no one would say it wasn't. But Oscar Wilde, most of all, wanted to come here and began to flourish perhaps even more in Europe once he had. Evelyn Waugh did some of his best work here. P.G. Wodehouse decided, having moved here, he'd never even visit England again. George Orwell, who was very suspicious of the American empire in the last few years of his life, replacing the British one, still most of all wanted to come to the United States and corresponded mainly with intellectuals around Partisan Review and magazines of that kind who would give him a home when he couldn't get one so easily in England. So all this was amazing. It was, again, I'd stress, welcoming, generous, open-minded, broad-minded, curious. I remember, I think it's in my book, a wonderful, beautiful female publisher taking me for a drink. I'd written practically nothing then, suggesting I might like to write a book for an American publishing house that you'd have heard of in some Sky bar in Manhattan. This was already good enough. I was 20. But her very solemnly suddenly saying to me, of course, the great advantage of you guys is that you have irony, which we don't. And I thought, well, I can't say nothing to that. But the best I'm going to be able to say is, well, apparently not. and instantly regretting saying so. And her looking just a little bit bewildered. I thought, I must be careful not to do that again.
You remind me of what you also say. It's about, and you use the word, girls, women in America being forward.
Well, yes. I mean, this I'd actually discovered in London for myself, that there was something different about American womanhood. Martin Amis in The Pregnant Widow most recently has sort of speculated that the real sexy ability of a woman can be defined as how much she can think like a man. Not in all things, but in the sexual relation. She can kind of picture what a man might be thinking. Very important. It seems to me American women were kind of born with that. And so had ideas of their own and would even make suggestions. You see me now, the slightly faded figure of a formerly magnificent mammal primate. But I used to have a really English reticence in that respect. I would always hope someone else would make the first move. I'd like to, or if I was going to make it, that somehow it had been cleared in advance. In a wonderful unspoken way, American women seem to sort of allow you to skip that stage.
but
the word English rose still makes me contract and retract as well, I have to say. It still does.
On going back to the politics of it, because, I mean, you were in the International Socialists for a long time. We should explain this was a sort of left-wing sect group, which, well, I mean, I could probably allow you to characterise it, which, as it were.
Happily do it. It was the word for it, rather understated, was not group or even groupuscule, let alone party, but a tendency. In other words, it was a thread in the argument over the future of Marxism and of a theory for the working class. And it came out of the left opposition. It's vulgarly called Trotskyist. I don't mind. It's a good enough shorthand for it. Which, in other words, from the only political tradition in Europe in the 20th century that had managed to oppose Stalinism, fascism, and imperialism at the same time, and deserves some credit for that, and is associated with some heroic figures.
Reading what you have to say about it, you're relatively kind and sympathetic towards it, because I've also spoken to your brother about it.
Yeah.
Compared to him, I mean, he now sweeps it aside as almost an absurd youthful indulgence. But you treat it quite sympathetically, insofar as some of the figures who are associated with it were figures you perhaps have gone on admiring, or you admired, if you like, the almost openness of it compared to some of the other left-wing sex groupuscules tendencies.
Indeed. For one thing, the writers and essayists and fighters who made up our tradition. I mean, once you've taken out the sort of grand heroic figures like Rosa Luxemburg or Trotsky or Andres Nin in Spain in Catalonia in the Civil War, people like C.L.R. James, the brilliant Trinidadian polemicist and historian. His book Black Jacobins is the really authentic history of the Haitian Revolution and the historic importance of that. Also a great writer about cricket, by the way. All these comrades tended to be polymaths. Victor Serge, whose memoirs of a revolutionary anticipate Solzhenitsyn in what they say about the Gulag, probably was the man who first used the word totalitarian to describe the new symbiosis of Stalinism with more traditional forms of oppression.
Yes, I mean, that was one of the...
People like that. Yeah. That's who you were encouraged to read. This is still a sort of half-buried but still alive tradition, both in literature and in politics and in the history of ideology, and I think it's an honourable one, shouldn't be obliterated. And then its best-known figure, exemplar, in our culture is probably George Orwell, I mean, who at the time regarded those people as comrades, in some cases had friendships with them. One could add Dwight MacDonald, Arthur Koestler, a few others. This is a kind of red thread through the history of the 20th century that most people who brought up to think in Cold War terms either don't or can't understand.
It was an anti-totalitarian thread, wasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, because what IS did was to criticize the Soviet Union at a time when other people were making excuses for it, or suggesting it was going through a rather nasty phase, but eventually socialism would be realized.
That's right. No, we thought the Soviet Union was beyond reform, and not only that, but we were fairly sure it couldn't last. I mean, if there was ever a conflict between the forces and relations of production, to borrow a Marxist expression, it was there. I mean, the bureaucracy couldn't allow people to think for themselves or to innovate in production or distribution or exchange, because anything like that, any sign of initiative, could be the death of the regime. Was actually more easy to analyze in Marxist terms, in some ways, than later Western capitalism was, because it was like a clockwork, rusted version of early Victorian capitalism. And so when people say no one saw the end of the Berlin Wall coming, except a few people like, admittedly true of Robert Conquest and a couple of others, it's not true of us. I mean, we not only thought it was coming, we thought we could analyze why it would come and that it would be a good thing.
But how much...
But this did not reconcile us to other incredible things that were happening when I was a young man in the late 60s. The takeover of Greece by a NATO military dictatorship, for example. The waging of a filthy war in Africa by Portugal, another NATO Western country. The obliteration of the ecology and people of Vietnam. The persistent alliance with a form of slavery in South Africa, run by the Dutch Reformed Church ideology of Calvinism.
In many cases, these, of course, things that you reported on yourself and wrote about.
Yeah, in time I lived to write about all those things and visit the scene of the crime, yeah.
Are you a Marxist now? You say you are, but I wonder what sort of a Marxist, because let's add in the other thing that IS believed, that they still believed in the idea that the working class were going to be the agent which overthrew the capitalist state, and part of the project of IS was not simply theoretical, but members of IS were actively expected to go out and to raise the consciousness of the workers so they would overthrow the state.
Yeah, well, you and I, Professor Taylor, can sit around rehashing glory days of the 60s and old picket lines and struggles and this kind. There's no shame in it. I mean, unlike a lot of people who wouldn't do the 60s again, or not in the same way, who've turned into self-haters and sort of think the whole thing was a waste of time, I don't think that at all. I wish I'd done some of it differently and better. But most of all, I wish I'd done a bit more about the things that were going on at that time. I wouldn't unlive it, in other words. So, yeah, we can do that. And we do, if we're given half a chance. But you can't lie to the young. You must not bullshit the young. It's an absolute principle. And these people were asking me questions, seriously, what should I do with my life? Should I commit to this or not? And I reviewed it, and I said, is there now an international working class movement linked at the point of production, internationalist, that could replace capitalism, as was once thought possible? No, there isn't. Is it in long-term decline, that idea? Yes. Is it coming back? I don't think so. Is there an ideology, at least, even without an anchorage in a material class movement, that could at least say it was the critique of capitalism that could transcend it? Not known to me, no. And the ones I've seen on offer, not very persuasive. At that point, it seemed meaningless to go on calling myself a socialist. I'd been doing it by that stage, if you're still saying it, you're doing it out of almost manneristic promptings, so as you don't get confused with just being another liberal. And it could be just that you can't bear to let go of something that used to mean a lot to you. And I'm so against sentimental attachments of that kind.
But liberal has become a cleaner, nicer word. for you now?
Not to me.
Hasn't it? Because there were one or two references.
I mean, I still find the word liberal very smug and disappointing. And I think I quote the late Conor Cruise O'Brien, who had a lot of arguments saying liberalism makes the rich world yawn and the poor world sick. That wouldn't be a complete description of it now, but I can remember how true that was at a certain point. But thinking like a Marxist, in other words, seeing how the materialist conception of history does actually work, as explaining human motivation, as well as a lot of developments in the material sphere, banishing the ideas of the supernatural and the superstitious axiomatically, telling people that their emancipation is not going to be delivered to them. There's no redemption, there's no salvation. It has to be your own act of freeing yourself. All this is very useful.
I can see why you don't want to embrace the word liberal, and understand why the word socialist is something that you now don't want to hang on to. Do you feel when you read the word the left, or left-wingers, or those on the left, do you know, is that now something which prompts a feeling of, well, not contempt, but a feeling of irritation, a feeling of annoyance? You don't feel of the left any longer?
Not really, no. They don't really allow it. I mean, when I took the view that the Saddam Hussein regime should no longer be allowed the private ownership of Iraq and its people and its resources, there was what you could call a rather small, and not unlike the old international socialist tendency, but small, scattered, but interesting group of people in Iraq who thought that way, especially among Iraqi Kurds, but not exclusively. Intellectuals, Trotskyists like Kenan Makia. And in other countries around the world, people thought, yes, obviously, no one on the left could possibly support any policy that presumed the survival of that regime. But by then you were beginning to scrabble a bit to keep that idea of the left going. I mean, if the majority of the left in the world, and actually the majority of liberals too, decides that they think Bush is a greater enemy than Saddam Hussein, well, that's what the left now thinks. Well, they can leave me out of that. Completely. I mean, I won't quarrel at that point. I'd rather be called a neoconservative at that stage.
Let's deal for a moment, forgive me for being crass, but
yeah,
people who have tried to explain your arguments about Iraq have said, you've been divorced from your roots, you've fallen in with some strange friends, you've made a great deal of money, you've lost contact. And I can remember there's a nice little, I think it was a quote, I think it was Salman Rushdie, who you very vigorously defended during the fatwa. He used the phrase that you become aligned with people that you're not like.
Well, that wouldn't be for the first time, if it was true. And I've been, obscenely rich for much longer than that, anyway. Make enough money to take any political position I want. If anyone wants to attribute it to... Now, that really would be vulgar Marxism, by the way.
Yes.
Well, Kenan Makia, the author of The Republic of Fear, which is the best analysis of the Saddam regime from class viewpoint, ideological viewpoint, analytical viewpoint, is exactly a brother of yours and mine from the 1960s left opposition. He was one of the best products of it. And it was his book, plus one or two others, that really laid out the case for regime change in Iran. If you're going to take sides in an argument that involves state power and diplomacy and war, well, then it doesn't matter whether you're me or Salman or Michael Moore or Harold Pinter. You're going to find that you're on your side or in your camp are people who you're not like. I mean, the Iraq War was opposed by His Holiness the Pope, by His Grace the Archbishop of Canterbury, by Vladimir Putin, by people whose names are almost too leprous to mention, Gerhard Schroeder, Jacques Chirac, professional political pimps of the lowest order. George Galloway, someone who managed to be both a pimp for and a prostitute of Saddam Hussein in the same cycle. I mean, I don't judge Salman's view by that. But I would put Paul Wolfowitz or Kanan Makir against any of the above mentioned, or Kofi Annan and his rackety, bought-out, oil-for-food, rotted United Nations. Easily and any day, and give reasons, as I do in the book, why that's true. These are people of real principle. I think the most appalling collection of opportunists and thugs it's possible to imagine. And I only mention the most celebrated public figures. I mean, behind that was something even more sinister that certainly Salman should have been able to see through, which is an alliance on the street between what's left of the hard left, the rather thuggish elements of the Socialist Workers' Party and the remains of the CP, the Communist Party, and the Muslim Brotherhood, openly allied against Western democracy for reasons that are too obvious to go into, though I don't mind going into them.
But you can see a little bit what Rushdie is talking about, because when you look at some of your old friends, they do seem, you can hear in their attacks upon you a disappointment about having lost something. I mean, if I look, I don't know, I mean, Ian Baruma or Terry Eagleton, I mean, these were, you were quite close to them.
It takes a lot to make me cry. Takes a lot to make me cry. I find the work of these people practically unreadable. It's not because I disagree with it. It's that I think what they've written is mediocre and hopelessly adapted to the needs of power in a way that mine, I don't think was. I mean, we who said we have to take the risk of removing this keystone of totalitarian power which is about to turn itself into a Rwanda, and not just mutate from a failed state into a rogue state and back again at a choke point of the world economy. That has to be opposed, and it's people freed from the large and horrible camp in which they've been forced to dwell. There's no need for any euphemism in that. The people who argue, I suppose you could say Terry Eagleton argues, or people like Ian Baruma who say, well, it's very risky, this kind of thing. Well, yes, it is. It's risky because you've let it get to that stage. Risky to get rid of Slobodan Milosevic. And the predictions that there'd be a lot more civil strife in Bosnia if we did intervene, or in Kosovo, were not to be dismissed. I didn't think they would be as bad as they were, but they could have been. But that doesn't mean you can't intervene. These are things that require intense reasoning and thought. What I got was none of that at all. I got basically, and again, as I said, it takes a lot to make me cry, and I have a fairly broad back and a fairly thick skin. What I got was, why have you become a tool of the Jewish lobby? Huh? Why have you joined the Bush family's relentless quest to pick a fight, which they've been trying to avoid for all these things? Why are you a warmongering neoconservative? Unbelievable stuff of this kind.
I've spoken with your brother quite recently, and you'll be aware of all those biographical accounts of you and him at home arguing. I asked him, I said, what on earth were you arguing about to such an extent that you eventually had to have a treaty hung up on the wall to stop you arguing? He couldn't remember what you argued about. Do you remember what you argued about?
Not really, but it wasn't about politics. It was more about my feeling that until his arrival, I had things more or less arranged as I wanted them, namely the whole attention of my mother, the possibility of marrying her, the possibility of elbowing her husband out of the picture one way or another, and, supreme power, at least in the microcosm. And this plan had not taken into account the arrival of a sibling.
No, he said...
Who was born slightly too near. I mean, I used not to be terribly interested in this new work on birth order and sibling rivalry and so forth, but I think there must be something in it. I think it's probably unfortunate for both Peter and for me that he was born at a time when he was too near me to be a baby brother, needing protection or inspiring that kind of feeling, but near enough to be a rival, and smart and tough.
He said that the idea was almost that arriving from the hospital, the notion was that perhaps he'd be sent back to the hospital the next day as well. And I put it to him, I apologised when I did. I said, look, it's a very vulgar Freudian to me, but you were both competing for your mother's love. And he said, he waved that away, but you confirmed that.
You're quite wrong to wave a thing like that away. It's not waveable away. I'm sure I can remember telling him he was adopted. For example, with a reasonable chance that he might believe it.
What a terrible thing.
Yeah. Well, no, when it's a matter of survival, I'm not to be trusted. I mean, I'm fairly ruthless.
Because speaking to him, there was very little about his mother, but in your book, I think it would be fair to say that she is the only woman in the book who is presented as a whole human being. Other women in your life are skipped over.
Yeah, well, I feel that anyone who's going to do a memoir probably has to give an account of both parents, because it may tell more about you than you intend to, but you've got to do your best to show roughly what your provenance is in that way. And then perhaps you're right in saying there should be at least one fully rounded profile of a female, because I'm not going to try and do all the others in that. I don't make it sound as if it's too much of an embarrass de richesse, but you can't do it every time. And if you can't do it fairly, then you better not do it at all. So that's why I begin the book by saying, on this, you'll have to ask them or someone else. The book isn't about that. If you can't do it properly and try and be fair to all sides, you better just make a self-denying ordinance, which I do.
But with male friends...
I didn't mention my children either. That was partly, I think, whether they asked me not to or not, I could feel that they'd just as soon be left out.
But male friends...
Male friends is absolutely different.
Why is it different?
Especially when you're trying to test the proposition, which I do in my chapter on Martin Amis. Is it possible to have a heterosexual relationship with a man? And my answer is, not in so many words, but the answer is, well, pretty nearly, yeah. It was as near as I could come. And so I was very stirred when I saw him being interviewed not very long ago, this year, since the book came out anyway, by Charlie Rose on PBS, and asked about me and our long attachment. And he said, well, what now when he looked back on it, it struck him as being an unconsummated gay marriage. Now, if you have any idea of Martin's contribution to the world of the heterosexual and relative abstinence, shall we say, from the world of the gay, I mean, that's as nice a compliment as one's likely to get from a chap with whom one hasn't actually got physical. So I think that's worth relating.
But I don't...
Whereas if I tell some story about it didn't really work out with Juliet or so forth, I really would feel I was wasting my time in other people's and possibly hers. And then someone who wasn't Juliet would call up and say, so, you had room for her, but not for me. And I could see all this coming, so I just said, I'm not doing it. The book's already nearly half as much again in length as the publishers asked for. And I haven't yet finished the stuff about Chile, Poland, Cuba, and Kashmir.
But a woman who read it...
Look, the book is about the struggle of ideas as refracted through some, but not all, personal relationships. But it's about the struggle for clarity in the ideological world.
I was trying to talk to somebody about you and your brother's views, and when I was doing it, it was difficult really not to avoid occasionally smiling at the ways in which to talk about the contradictions. When I was talking to him and I was talking about the family and I was talking about divorce and I was talking about abortion and I was talking about homosexuality, do you recognize an affinity in the certainties that you both espouse? Do you recognize a complementary intolerance of ambiguity?
Yes, I do. Because I've noticed that on things where we actually do agree, without checking with each other, I sometimes find that we often find the same kinds of politician repulsive, for example. Often for slightly different reasons, but there's the same feeling. How can anyone look at this guy, say it's Bill Clinton, without realizing you're dealing with this sort of dangerous phony, sort of hopeless case of narcissism? And why would anyone volunteer to help, be proud to help, to pump up this already bloated ego? What's going on here? Some kind of appalling masochism. I didn't know what he thought about it until I published my own stuff, or maybe vice versa. He's good on things like that. As he is, for example, on the wretched church of which he's a member. I mean, he understands as much and as easily as I do that Rowan Williams just does this perfect impersonation of a Welsh sheep trapped, bleating on some hillside in the rain. And it's more of a tragedy to him than it is to me. But you can't miss a thing like that. And he wouldn't be him if he didn't. I mean, it's very typical of him. It's his form of Trotskyism, if you like. He can only be a member of the Church of England on condition that he's a member of the most extreme, isolated, derided opposition group within it.
Absolutely.
But I'd rather be a Trotskyist, frankly, but with all the hazards.
If I say the name Horace Mann, you're probably going to know that I'm going to use that quotation from him, which he said, "Until you've done something for humanity, you should be ashamed to die." I think that you say that's a pretty tall order.
Yes.
Would you allow that of yourself? Would you like to feel that that is true to an extent?
No, I can't really say that, I don't think. But I'm hoping to, if this wouldn't seem like a rather melancholy coda. Because, as you know, I have a malignancy in my chest. Quite a lot of it now, of my chest. And the possible treatments for this are remarkable. And I live in a revolutionary age to have cancer, as it turns out. And there are experiments that are being conducted, and I've volunteered to take part in 2 or 3 of them. And there may be a couple more where I could be a guinea pig. It's also a rather sad time to have cancer as well as an inspiring one, because I don't think this used to be the case with people. They would die knowing there was a treatment that was just out of their reach. That will probably happen to me. There was tantalizingly near, and there are some so tantalizingly near they might work if I can hold on long enough. Now, plainly, I'm doing this for myself. I want to hang on. But I also do feel that I'm willing to go to places I didn't need to go, to have my gene sequenced, for example, and my genome analyzed, and to have some tests conducted that they don't hold out any prospect of success for, but that might benefit other people. And Horace Mann was in my mind when I thought about doing that. I thought, you probably need to be nearer death to be deciding, well, how are you going to pass the test? This will be what I hope to contribute, or bequeath, if you like. And it's a lot better than the other offers I had, which were to go to prayer breakfasts in my own honor.
I can't see you.
Which I didn't think would meet the test either way. In fact, would rather rather than negate the idea.
Christians have been rather nice to you, haven't they, when you consider the assault that you made? You've been making upon them recently. They're all praying for you, aren't they?
One of them in particular, well, not all Christians are praying for my recovery, I should add.
Oh, they somehow see this as a divine...
Well, no, I mean by that to say there are some who pray for me to die horribly in order to set an example to other backsliders, and not only to die horribly, but then to be reborn and then never to die, to live forever in agony. There's that tendency, faction. And then there are those who say they're praying for me, and only after a while, after I got a lot of these messages, so I start writing back saying, do you mind if I ask, when you say you're praying for me, praying for what? And many of them were honest and wrote back saying, praying for you to become someone who accepts Jesus as his personal saviour. Not for me to get better. Or to get better plus that, but not only that. Well, I thought it was nice of them to clarify. But one Christian in particular has become very important to me and is, I think, a very exemplary person. You may have heard of him. He's called Francis Collins, Dr. Francis Collins. Well, he's the head of the National Institute of Health and the National Cancer Institute at the moment. And he is the man who was given the job in the 90s of completing the Human Genome Project and brought it in complete, ahead of time and under budget in the early years of the Clinton administration. A gigantic contribution to medicine as well as to our understanding of what we have in common with other animals, and is the final blow to all those who doubt that we are evolved rather than created. And Francis is a believing Christian of a C.S. Lewis kind, I would say. And he's taken a strong personal interest in me and introduced me to doctors who can help me, if I want to think of it like that, help other people by doing new pathway treatments, or help myself perhaps as well, on the off chance. So that's a rather nice symbiosis.
Have you, it's a quotation that you use at the beginning of your book, The Hamlet, you always made me laugh. Your tirade, your invective, your name-calling, apart from all the other things about your writing that I admire, but it was often the laughter. Have you lost all your mirth?
No. I have foregone all custom of exercise, but that was a long time ago. Never could quite discipline myself in that way. No, I hope I don't seem mirthless in the least. I wouldn't say I've found any more funny sides to dwell on than I had before. But certain jokes at the expense of the species, about being born into a losing struggle, being created sick and then ordered by God to be well, and all this, do seem even more pertinent when you have to live with the thought every day that it could be your last one.